Okay, this video is going to introduce cycles of matter in section 4.3, and I'm actually going to divide this into two videos because otherwise it gets way too long, and sometimes you need to study one more than the other. So to start off with, I want us to focus on the relationship between energy flow from the last two videos, or I can't remember if that was two or one video, but energy flow, trophic levels, things like that, and the cycles of matter. And what really happens is that flow of energy is what drives the cycles of matter and what powers them. And so these are very closely related. We'll see a lot of overlap between them because as that energy moves from one trophic level to the other, that's where we see the movement of materials and nutrients through all the living organisms of the ecosystem and even return then back to the abiotic factors, the soil, the water, the atmosphere, etc., within the ecosystem. We're going to try and divide these processes that are responsible for the cycling of matter into biological processes, geological processes, physical and chemical processes, and human activities. So this color coding that you see labeled here is what you'll see in all the diagrams from the textbook that we'll look at as well. So we're going to start and cover the water cycle and the carbon cycle in this first video, and then I'll do a separate video for the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and a description of nutrient limitation, because those are usually the two main factors for that. So with the water cycle, this one's pretty easy. You guys have probably studied this since elementary school. Essentially, you have mainly physical and chemical processes going on. Let me get a laser pointer going. Things like precipitation, which is going to move water from the atmosphere to the groundwater. You have runoff from the groundwater to the oceans. And then you have evaporation from bodies of water back to the atmosphere. We also have some biological processes that are particularly important to talk about, and that is transpiration. And so this is a process where water is evaporated directly out of living organisms. So like directly out of the leaves of the trees and other plants. So that is called evapotranspiration or just transpiration. So that's the important biological process to remember. And again, this is a very simplified water cycle. Pretty much you've probably studied it, and transpiration, evapotranspiration would be the one that might trip you up in the future. So moving on to carbon cycle. So in the carbon cycle, on this diagram, we're mainly going to focus on the human, geological, and physical chemical processes, and I will explain more of the biological on the next slide. So let's start with the physical and chemical processes, because these are pretty easy. We have atmospheric CO2, which is a major source of carbon, and that CO2 can be dissolved within water, and then it can be released back to the ocean. So there's quite a bit of dissolved CO2 within oceans and large bodies of water. We call them carbon sinks. They can have a great capacity to hold on to the CO2, and then various things, temperature changes, things like that, upwellings will cause it to release that CO2 back to the atmosphere. Okay. If we look at geological processes, so carbon is what is the primary atom that makes up organic molecules, and these are the large complex molecules that make up living things like sugars and fats and proteins and nucleic acids. All of those are based around carbon, and we'll talk more about that in our next unit. So in the CO2 from the water, from the living organisms within the water, from the land, etc., end up deposited within various sediments. And then if you remember from sixth grade, the rock cycle, those sediments can be compressed over millions and millions of years, and you get rocks. Well, these rocks that have the carbon in them can go through various volcanic activity, and that CO2 can be released back to the atmosphere. So we have that geological cycling from the living organisms and from the water into the sediments, into the rocks, and from the rocks, they can be released back to the atmosphere. So volcanoes do release quite a bit of CO2 back to the atmosphere. Finally, let's look at some of the human activities that are contributing to the carbon cycle. And so if we look at these fossil fuels, again, fossil fuels come from living organisms, and living organisms are primarily based around carbon molecules. So these the carbon from those living organisms end up compressed into these fossil fuels, things like coal, oil, natural gas. And humans will then burn these fossil fuels, combustion, and release that CO2, release that carbon as CO2 back to the atmosphere. We're also doing things like tearing down forests and burning off all the trees and releasing that CO2 back to the atmosphere as well. So we have a lot of actions that we're doing releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. And if you haven't heard of it before, that's a big issue as far as greenhouse effect and climate change. While I have this diagram up, I'm going to really quickly show the cycling of the biological processes, and we have it going on both in the atmosphere and the land and in the ocean as well. And we have the organisms that will take in carbon from the atmosphere in the form of CO2 through photosynthesis, and then cycles from the producers, the plants, the algae, things like that, into other organisms as they eat them. Again, the relationship between the energy flow and the nutrient cycling. Those organisms will break down those materials, those sugars and everything else, and release the CO2 back to the atmosphere. So we have the cycling, the biological cycles as well. So if we go on to the next slide, let's talk about those biological processes a little bit more. So the first process that's extremely important you need to know is photosynthesis. And the overview for now is that photosynthesis uses CO2, sunlight, and water to produce organic, which just means carbon-based molecules for living things. And primarily they're focused on producing a sugar called glucose. So we can see that it has 6 carbons within this sugar. So this sugar is the primary fuel source for living organisms. So here, the CO2, we need the H2O as well. Sunlight enters, there's the chloroplasts that are carrying out photosynthesis, and the sugar is produced. And also some oxygen as well. The sugar then is transferred into other living organisms it's also used by the plant itself and other living organisms that eat the plants through a process called cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is a process that breaks down organic molecules to produce energy for the cell, and then it's releasing the CO2 as the byproduct as it breaks down that sugar molecule. It gets the energy out, and the CO2 is just released. So that energy is called ATP, and that's what's directly used by the cell to drive all the processes. It also releases some heat. So that cellular respiration is carried out by all living organisms to break down the sugars to directly produce the energy needed for the cell. And there's the CO2 that's being released back to the atmosphere. So if we go back to this diagram as well, we have photosynthesis going on up here, and then we have cellular respiration going on this side to release the CO2 back to the atmosphere. So I'm going to leave and stop here. I'm going to make a separate video then for the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle.